My name is Eric Malloy. I am the Director of Client Relations with AKAM. And today our panelists joining us will be David Riddle, Director of West Palm Beach with Falcon Engineering, and Mr. Alex Argento, who is the Vice President of Operations for AKAM Southeast. Let me go ahead and stop my screen share. And then David will hand it over to David, and then you can begin your presentation. Oh, there he went.
Touch the wrong button.
That's all right. Good afternoon, David. Thanks a million for being here. We really appreciate it. We're looking forward to this discussion. I think for our viewers, David's going to take us through, this is a CEU eligible class for credit. So you can provide your details to Eric and we'll take care of all that housekeeping. But I think the key to this is that a lot of our associations are now looking for ways to future-proof, to look forward to amenities that weren't even considered back in the day when many of these structures were actually built or the infrastructure was put in place. So I think today, great part, we're going to take you all through from the initial design through some construction, through some costs, and then considerations for the idea of adding EV charging to your community. So with that, David, thanks a million for being here.
Appreciate it. Again, David Riddle with the Falcon Group. So I'm in the Falcon West Palm Beach office. Down here in Florida, we have 3 locations to serve everybody. I'm here in West Palm. We have a Miami office, and we also have a Tampa office. So we pretty well reach most of the central part of the state and down. In addition to being able to help out with things like this, with EV chargers, we do pretty much anything engineering that you could think of. So right now, facade restoration, concrete restoration, stucco, structural integrity reserve studies, all of that, we can handle that and help you out with it. And paving, pavement, parking lots, that's something else we do. So pretty much if it's engineering, we can help you with it. Now let's see if I can share my screen here. And I want to welcome everybody to EV charging stations for condominiums. If I can get my pardon me for some technical difficulties. There we go. Now we can advance the slide. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about what is an EV charger versus an EV charging station. What types of stations there are out there? Really, how much power? How do we figure out how much power we need for these things? Permitting, some incentives. Of course, the important one: how do we meter and make sure that the people that are using it are paying an appropriate amount? And then we're going to wrap up with some general considerations. And I think as we go through, I think Alex and I are going to be able to kind of go back and forth a little bit with some comments on the slides. So with that, we'll start moving forward. So people talk about EV chargers, and from a technical standpoint, the EV charger is actually on board the vehicle. And what we're really talking about is the EV charging station. So that gas pump looking like thing that's setting out in your parking lot. So that's more what we're talking about today. So again, the vehicle has its own software on board to be able to figure out how to charge, how much to charge. And it's the charging station that's kind of that power port, if you will, to plug in and move forward.
And David, I think that's an important piece just for our listeners, that the car has the infrastructure built into it to know when to stop, when enough is enough, that it's working, and that the power pole, and I think sometimes people get confused about this, is like a gas pump at a gas station. You're either pumping fuel through it or you're not. And all the brains are in the vehicle. So again, for our audience, the whole point here is that we're going to be talking about the station and what the station can do in terms of turning on and off the flow of electricity. to the vehicle that is managing the receipt of that power.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. And so we have different levels. And again, as far as for future proofing, this is something that is really changing. In a year from now, 2 years from now, it's probably going to be a slightly different presentation as we talk about these. First level, level one, we liken that kind of to a golf cart, but there's still vehicles out there that you bring it home, put it in the garage, and you just plug it in to a receptacle that's there. Again, there's a handful of the vehicles that are still out there. This is, again, usually the lowest cost option. Sometimes it could be almost a zero cost option if you happen to have an outlet with enough power available to it, like a dedicated 20 amp circuit, which is not abnormal to find in a garage. But this is also the slowest feature. We're looking at an overnight charge to get your battery back up with a level one charger. So again, that's where typically you're not going to want to see this at a condominium level. And if you have individual unit owners that have their own, or some private parking garages that I've seen in a number of condominiums, perhaps they might have this type of charger. But again, from a condominium perspective, a common element charging station, you would not want to have a level one charger. Most of the time in the condominium world, we're going to have a level two charger. This can vary depending upon the particular charging station selected. It can take anywhere from again, as much as 6 hours down to an hour or two to be able to charge. It's still not getting to that 5 or 10 minute charge like we get with an ICE or internal combustion engine vehicle, which I guess that's another terminology here that we could to use. Not touching on any politics, but in the realm of EV, we use the word ICE. And so that's internal combustion engine. And it actually does somewhat come into play when we talk about EV charging stations. But again, the level two is what you're really typically going to be looking for. Your owners will be able to come up, plug the car in, go back up to their unit, let it charge. And getting a little ahead of myself, even some of these units can even send a text when they're done, that kind of stuff. The cost on this one can really vary. It depends upon the infrastructure that you have there. If we have available power, and we're going to talk more about this in depth, if we have available power, it's going to be a lower cost. Like you and I were talking on Monday, we've seen some of these $2,500, $4,000 a piece level. If you have the infrastructure there that's available. To the next level, the level three, these are closer to the level like you're going to see if you're driving up the Florida Turnpike. The charging times on these they've gotten them down to about 30 minutes. And the idea is that you can go into a retail store, you can plug in your level three charger, head into your shopping, come back out, and your vehicle has been charged and is ready to go another few hundred miles. However, again, this is not only do the charging stations tend to be much more costly, the infrastructure to support them it tends to be more costly. It is as with the level two, the power, the 240, 208 volt that we typically see readily available in condominiums and even HOAs, not an issue. 480 volt, 460 volt, depending upon where you are, that's a lot harder. A high-rise condo, a lot of times we might be able to get the 460, 480. But HOA, you're definitely not going to get that kind of power level. But again, these are definitely the faster, quicker charges.
I think, David, what's also important for consideration, and I think, again, for our folks at home, that the power requirements for a level two versus a level three, also based on the age of your community. Just speak to that a bit, sort of just what that looked like. If I was built in the 70s or the 80s, sort of what that would mean.
Yes, and 1970, we didn't have, even into the 1980s. I see, the typical unit has a 100 amp panel. Maybe we have a 4,000 amp switchgear coming into the building. Today we wouldn't build a unit without even thinking about at least a 200 amp panel. We have so much electrical, that we're using. So, additional AAC units, our TVs, everything that you could possibly think of that you don't think about taking electric power. So, a facility that was built, say, in 1968, that has a significantly smaller, would have a significantly smaller switchgear, which is the main piece of equipment, electrical equipment right inside of the building. So that determines how much power is available for the entire facility. So as time has gone on, that piece of equipment has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger with newer and newer properties. So 1968, it may be a very, very expensive proposition because you may have to go back to FPL, ask for, a larger service coming into the building. Maybe they have it in the area, maybe they don't. And certainly the switch gear that we're talking about, I've installed commercial switch gear that the switch gear alone cost $1 million. So, not saying that that's what it is, because switch gear in this type of application can be cheaper than that, but it's not going to be a small cost. So if you're an older property, it's even more critical to understand the load you have right now and how to be able to maximize, what you have available.
I think that's important also just for everyone, that the idea of just level setting what the project, wants to be and wants to achieve. And I'm with you, I'm in the Boca area, and, at the local Wawa, there's, 15 of these superchargers, which are tremendously expensive, but very efficient. We'd all love that at our community. But again, just from the jump, if your property is built in, pre 1980 versus pre 1990 versus pre 2000, you really want to think about these minimum requirements. So as we go through, we'll talk about that more. But again, that level of expectation of cost of what your community will absolutely be able to deliver is really important to talk about, foundationally. And again, that's why we have you.
So what is the steps you should take to, if you're thinking about going down this pathway, which, again, with what's out there, the EV electric vehicles, I guess it's redundant to say EV vehicles, but electric vehicles, they've been around for a while, and we're seeing, whether they're going to be, take over the world in the next year, probably not. But 10 years from now, I think we're going to see more, because they, in a lot of ways, make sense. So what's the very first step? The first step is understanding how much power and infrastructure you have on your property. And so that first step would be doing a load study, where you would engage an engineer, and a lot of times we typically will work with a contractor as well. Because unfortunately, engineers, we're limited in the equipment we're allowed to be able to take apart and take measurements of. So for insurance purposes, so that's why a lot of times we will work with a contractor to actually physically go in. We'll look at the drawings, evaluate what's there right now, actually physically go out on site. We'll take some measurements out of some panels, see exactly what the loads are, and then be able to bring all that information back to the office, run through calculations, and be able to figure out, exactly how much power is available. So the next slide, kind of that same process, going through that process. Step one, we go out, we gather the data, we look at the drawings, we take the measurements, we come back, we do the calculations, and then we'll give the association a comprehensive report. And that report's going to be more than just, the load. While the load study is the first part of it, there's a number of other things that have to go into consideration beyond just your electrical infrastructure. That's a large part about it, but the report also should include a few other things, such as, looking, and this is in cooperation with the association, how many chargers are you looking to install? We have a number of properties that, hey, you know what, we want to get started with maybe 2 of them, but we really know down the line we're going to want to put 8 of them in. And that's very different because we can look at not only diversity, but we can look at load managing technologies that are out there to allow us to be able to kind of multiply what we have available. So, we kind of, what a load management strategy will do is if we have a particular charger plugged in and we charge 3 more in, we'll be able to rotate through those. It takes a little bit longer to charge the vehicles at that point, but we'll be able to rotate through equally. And so where our infrastructure may only allow for 2, maybe we can put 6 of them in and serve that many more people within the community. We'll talk probably a lot more in depth with this. Alex, you and I suspect we'll have a great conversation at the end with other association considerations. So we'll lightly touch on them here before we really drill down towards the end of the presentation. And there's a lot of non-technical stuff that you really have to think about with the EV charging station. Number one, where are you going to put them? Alec, you and I talked on Monday again about the property in Highland Beach that doesn't allow any EVs within the at least the charging within their parking garage. So are we going to put it in the parking garage? Are we going to put it outside? Where outside? If we do it outside, what's available? Where does it make sense? So it's more than just the infrastructure, but that's the primary focus of the report. But the other part of the report is to kind of address some of these issues as well, to at least get the association to think through how do we want to go? Do we go this direction? We want to go that way? Again, this is just not as simple. If you get nothing else from this presentation, understand that this is not just as simple as putting one of these charging stations out there and plugging it in electrically. There's a lot else that goes into it.
Very much so, David, and we will get into it. I think one thing, and this photo is a great opportunity just to touch on, is that you see 5 or 6 power poles here, stations here. An association may, to your point, choose to do 1 or 2, but you want to expand down the road. As an association, you don't want to have to go through all the costs of just developing the load, developing where the spaces are going to be. So when you think about future proofing and expansion down the road, you really want to design for something more robust, right? If we have typical associations of more than 100 cars, certainly 2 stations are not gonna suffice down the road. And again, wherever you fall down on your belief of EV charging growth, we're seeing it rapidly. We have tremendous Tesla owner representation in many of our communities. And again, just the expansion of where you will go next. If you have a more campus style association where you have bigger acreage versus just a monolithic tower, high rise, does the front of the community versus the back of the community versus putting in the middle of the community matter? Is there infrastructure there for it? How does that weather? How does that work? How do people access it? So again, I think, David, these are all robust questions. Also, and we'll touch on it a little bit, is from an insurance perspective, you want to think about it, right? You also want to think it from a life safety perspective. There are fire implications with batteries and charging. We've all seen it in the news. We'll talk about it. But again, do you want to be inside versus outside? God forbid there was ever a fire. How would that vehicle's fire be put out? How would it be dragged out of a parking structure versus being outside our? So these are considerations to think about.
And David, we also had a question too that came in that I think is maybe a little pertinent. But just to kind of touch on it, would the process be the same? Because what we're talking about is based on the picture here. We're looking at more of a commercial sort of charging station. But is the process the same as sort of the outlook, everything the same if an association is dealing with an individual unit owner that wants to install an individual charging unit and their deeded parking space?
Yes, and actually, that actually brings up 2 very good points. To answer the question directly, yes, it's exactly the same process. You need to figure out where what power is available, and if the power can support that individual charger. And so again, getting a little bit ahead of ourselves in the slide, but I think it's important to throw out there. It doesn't hurt to talk about this issue twice. Again, the statute says you can't stand in the way of allowing an individual unit owner to install an EV charging station for themselves. And that's great. They have to pay for it and they pay for the increase in insurance and all that stuff. But what happens if you have 4 individual unit owners and 2 years down the road, the association starts saying, oh yeah, we probably ought to think about this as a community. And now we come in and do it, and maybe you can put in one more charger because you don't have any more power available because the individual unit owners have taken it. So again, that's why this presentation is get out ahead of this so that to be blunt and to be greedy, that way the association takes the power, and there may or may not be power left available for individual, and that way you're serving the maximum number of people with the infrastructure that you do have available. But the same general process is definitely required, whether it's individual or for the whole community. It's just on an individual level, we may be only looking at their electrical panel and some of the issues that brings into a challenge, or the association going to have to sub-meter, and that's again we'll talk a little bit about that in some slides coming up.
Perfect.
Technological issues here, for some reason. There we go. Not wanting to advance, and so actually, Alec, this is exactly to really summarizing exactly what you just talked about with the importance of doing this. Getting that report out there, helps start thinking through the process of where do we want to put this? How big do we want to do this? And, I think it's a bold statement to say future proof, but as I'm not sure that we're future proofing, because I've learned with my many years in the construction industry, I've learned there's no such thing that 10 years from now, we'll be putting in things that none of us on this call are even thinking about right now. But at least it puts you in a better position. And the one thing I guarantee you, if you ignore it and don't do something about it, and don't proactively think about it, you're going to be painted into some corners that you might not want to be comfortably painted into, and that you could have avoided if you start thinking about this process today. So we're going to change gears a little bit. What about permitting? As with anything, permitting is required. Interesting interpretation of some of the statutes in Florida. I was reading a Florida bar article a couple weeks ago, and the attorney made a very good point. Technically, all construction in Florida is illegal. You are not allowed to do construction. There are exceptions, and the exceptions are when you have a permit with a licensed design professional and a licensed contractor, you're allowed to do construction. So I get asked the question frequently, not just in EV chargers, but in stations, but in many others, do I need a permit? And I can guarantee you 99% of the time, the answer is yes. Pretty much everything needs to have a permit. And I guarantee you, this is one where 100% of the time, you're going to need a permit. Again, the local authority having jurisdiction, it may vary a little bit, say from, North Palm Beach to Fort Lauderdale, but the general requirements are going to be the same. Now, the good news is that unlike a lot of new technologies, while this is new technology, it's really based upon a lot of old technology. We know what electrical loads are. We know how we're loading up our wiring. We know how we're loading up our transformers. So while the particular device that's being attached might be different, the plan reviewer and plans examiners and the local authority of jurisdiction or code official, the basics behind it, they understand and understand very well. So fortunately, this is, will help us make the process go smoother. This is something that it's, again, depending upon municipality, sometimes, the process goes smooth, sometimes it doesn't, but this is not going to be something that is difficult to get set up, but they are going to expect, again, similar to anything else you did with mechanical drawing, so forth. You're going to need electrical, signed and sealed electrical drawings with calculations that show you're able to support the equipment that you're wanting to install. They're going to want to see what type of equipment you're installing. Again, just very much like any other construction project that you would do.
I think also what's important here, David, and maybe you could speak to this a little bit here, is, and we may be getting ahead, is that once you're ready to go in with a full set of drawings to your building department, HA, that you also want somebody looking at aesthetically the whole setup. Like, how does it look in your community? How are the spaces going to be set up? What kind of signage are you going to have? What kind of power system did you choose? Where are your cords? Where are not your cords? What kind of lights are there? I think oftentimes for communities, when contractors drive this, it's not always the happiest of look or ending aesthetically. And I know, David, from Falcon's perspective, you work with you guys work with condo associations and HOAs all the time. This is what you do. And so I think one of the other things that's important to consider here for everyone listening is that there is this idea of what you're going into permit, but there's also the finished aesthetic look of what the station's going to look like in your community. And that's another thing where costs and overruns and the like are really important to consider when you're developing these drawings.
That again brings up a good point, Alec, as well. That again at Falcon, we're condominium and HOAs. That's pretty much what we do here in Florida. I think in the more than 4 years I've been with Falcon, I think I've done maybe one or two non-condominium or HOA projects. And one of those I inherited prior to the company had prior to me getting here. So we understand that's a good part of that report as well, because again, there's so much that's not technical that goes behind it. So having someone that understands, being able to stand up in front of your ownership to be able to explain and here's why it's important for this to be in this particular place. Yes, I know it's not the best looking place, but here's the benefit of why it's there. And so, by the time we get down to this permitting, all of that is absolutely locked into place and moving forward.
Excellent.
Switch gears.
Sorry, I was gonna say, we just had a quick question come in, and I don't know if really you would have putting you on the spot here, but possibly the question came in is what would say like a typical low end, high end cost maybe be for an individual homeowner for like plans. And I know I'm probably putting you on the spot, but maybe just like a ballpark, something that they could expect.
For an individual unit owner, probably because usually $1,500 to $2,000 for an individual. If we have the information, it's straightforward. Especially if it's an association that we've done a lot of work with in the past and have the information. For individuals, there may be other lower cost providers out there, but for the condominium associations, the HOAs that are doing more. I'm trying to remember. I think the last proposal I saw was around $5,000 to do the study. And again, that was for the whole association in that. So,
I understand there's factors at play that can increase or decrease the cost. And again, I hate to put you on the spot like that. But yeah, but I think it's always remember to, even for an individual, I'm a recent EV adopter. I just recently got one. I will say to everyone, I love it. I'm a huge fan of it now. The outlay initially, right, is as you mentioned, in 5 or 10 years, this is going to be more of a common thing. The combustion engines will become, I think the market will be split pretty much even. So the cost now to have this installed will assist you further down the line, and the cost savings that I am seeing just in switching over to an EV have far outweighed my outlay of the plans, the permitting, and the actual installation. So always, I want to warn people, like, keep that in mind. There are significant savings, but the upfront cost is kind of what we're talking about, the planning. But thank you.
And I think to that point, Eric and David, we've talked about this before, and maybe just to be clear for people, for for HOAs, for single family homes and communities where you're essentially putting, a charger in your own home for your own use, it's pretty straightforward. The loads of your house, what's the infrastructure in the street, what's around, these aren't so hard to figure out because you're never going to expand sort of beyond you as technology expands. However, if you're in a condominium association where whether you're in a tower or in a multi-building situation, the statute says that they can't preclude you from doing it, but they don't have to actually pay for it. So again, I think one of the things, Eric, for that homeowner just to understand is that while you may live in a 20-story building, but you have a ground floor exterior parking space that's 30 feet away from the building, all the costs for the engineering of getting power to that space, the infrastructure costs for the electrical requirements, the metering, and any of the future use, including all the permitting and the required ongoing permitting and insurance, is really on you. So sort of, David sort of said earlier, we have a few associations where, a lucky few had garages that were built by developers as an amenity down the road, and we might throw a level one in there and it's sort of straightforward. But I think in your general bigger, few hundred unit or bigger communal living, these expenses get really quite large, and you would need your own engineer, your own team, to work through this. So I think it's really important.
Yeah.
Yeah, Alec, you're right. It's very important to understand, again, the difference, HOA, and again, HOAs may want to consider, because again, having it's great community amenity to have, but the individual unit owners actually ties very nicely into the next slide, great transition, into the incentives. And, FPL has some incentives that we're looking at here. Actually had someone that I work with who just recently purchased a electric vehicle and went with an FPL program. And I will say he's a single family home in an HOA. And it's some of the drawback. It was a 10-year commitment, which he was a little uneasy about, but it's like $40 a month. And they take care of the permitting and all of that. Unfortunately, for the high-rise condominiums and for the HOA communities themselves, the communities themselves might have a little bit, but that individual incentive isn't there. But there are some other incentives that FPL is offering, and somewhat the Florida statute, we start getting into more of a legal world than a technical world when we start talking about some of the incentives. But the big thing is to know that some of them are out there, and so many of them are very specific to your location, your application. That again, this is something that we can talk about as we're going through the planning process as to what makes sense. And so, as an example, for here, I think we have Duke Energy, but FPL's is very similar in what they have. Again, I know for a fact FPL has a program where for a single family home, they will put the charging station in your garage for you. But I believe that there's some others that we might be able to shoehorn in for some of the high rise condominiums. So the important thing though is just asking. And as with all advancing technologies, and things such as this, there's other external factors and influences, and I'll just leave it at that, that potentially could have huge impacts for whether there are incentives or not incentives for going forward. Getting to the next, it's most important. I mean, certainly, it would be nice if of the associations to let everybody charge their cars for free, but I don't think you want to do that. It's going to be not only discussions with other unit owners that don't have EV chargers, why they're paying someone else's bill. It would definitely start getting costly. And so again, with that report that we're looking at, you're going to start talking to the association about how do you want to meter this? Again, we do a separate meter, and then that way, we're able to charge things out. Load monitoring, load management. Again, a lot of this is where a third party vendor can kind of come in handy. We work with a few associations that are trying to go out on their own, but the vast majority are bringing in a third party vendor, where the third party vendor is responsible for the power pole and beyond, and the association is just responsible for getting the infrastructure to that point. And so, makes it again, having that third party provider makes it a lot easier, because they have already developed a lot of the infrastructure themselves for billing and metering and that kind of stuff. So again, though, if you're looking to go out and buy it and go out on your own, this is definitely another consideration to understand that this is potentially yet another duty that you may have to add to your property management company. And whether or not they actually have the ability to do it. And again, we're finding that it really makes the most sense to engage a third-party provider for the power pole itself.
I think one of the other things, David, that we talked about that's important here is that the ability for a third party. So just to make sure everyone understands what we're talking about here in the photo, the EV charging station that the gentleman's putting his credit card on, that's sort of your infrastructure. That's your hard part, but your hardscape, if you will. But inside of it, what he's touching the credit card to goes back to a software. And like any software company, if you're paying for a parking space, in downtown Fort Lauderdale on the street, and you go to the kiosk and you pay, there's a firm that processes it and takes your charge and handles your credit card payment, and anything that are a problem for I was overcharged or the like. You really don't want your association dealing with that. The other thing that we find with third parties are they're very good at being able to give you the costs and the changes to costs. So the cost of electricity in your particular area, how that's maintained, how you can change pricing, what the association's rules are. You also can charge, again, we talked about this, you can charge a different price for a visitor from a resident. So a resident may get the lowest cost for charging their car, where guests pay more market rate. So again, that could be source of income for an association, depending on how many you have, so, and help offset the cost of the initial installation. So these are all managed, by third parties. And again, I think to David's point, what we see most times is this is just not something that, your average management office is just, ready to take on to this program. So, and they're built-in costs. So you don't typically see another invoice for it. It's just in the cost of the electric that you use for that person charging the car, not to the association.
So the way I kind of liken this is, just like you in your unit, you have power that comes up to a plug in your outlet. And so, likened to the association would be responsible for, bringing the power to that outlet. And then that third party, it's a little more complicated than this, but that third party would then kind of plug into that outlet and take it from there. And so, they're typically responsible for the maintenance and repairs of the tower itself, as well as, again, collecting the billing. And usually, again, they cut a check back to the association. There's as many variations as there are providers. And so again, this is another important part to work with an engineering firm and someone that can understand, who are the providers out there that you want to work with that are providing the good deals and stand behind it. Jumping to the next, there's kind of these two slides really kind of tie together. You got the smart meter stations, where again, this is that third party provider that's going to come in and handle it for you, versus a self-administered. If you put a sub meter out there, and there's a number of ways of doing it, it just is really adding to the system and the management process. And so again, what we're charging for is the kilowatt hours, and so that's what they would pay, and again, a couple of different ways of monitoring it. Now to the important part. There's actually we're showing 4 of them up here, but there's actually, I'm sorry, 3, but I would argue that there's actually 4. And we really don't talk about the 4th because that's, they got to write if the association is doing it themselves, which again, almost no one does. I think at the end of the day, I don't know anybody that has taken this on as a venture. So generally we're looking at 3 different ways that a unit owner could have to pay for it. Kind of going backwards, a subscription plan, similar to our Netflix. You get either unlimited or a certain fixed amount of kWh per month that you're going to utilize. Then to the next, where like we saw on that first slide, where guy's touching his credit card to the charging station, so they could pay to charge right there. And then, again, very similar to the parking, there are some third parties out there have apps that you can bring up and pay for the charging right there. As we touch on this next slide, it actually has a lot more that we cover than what's there, because there's so many other considerations that the association has to take into account. For example, the average EV is about 40% heavier than an ICE vehicle. And so your structure may have issues. If you're putting 2 or 3 or 4 in a particular area in a garage, probably not going to be an issue. It's probably worth looking at just to see. But, if you want to rack up 10 of these, because that's where the spot is, then maybe you need to take a little closer look at the structure, because maybe there needs to be some beefing up of the structure. Alec mentioned it a little bit earlier in the presentation. One of the issues with EVs, while it's doesn't happen a lot, it does happen. Occasionally, these EVs will catch on fire. And for an ICE vehicle, it catches on fire, maybe 2 fire extinguishers, and it's done. 10 minutes, maybe not even, the fire department will show up because the alarm went off. They'll make sure everything is fine. They'll leave the car there. It's the owner's issue to deal with it. No problem. An EV, again, you got to think about, sometimes these vehicles will burn 2 and 3 days. I've literally heard of fire departments that in order to put them out, they basically pull them out and bury them. Definitely have seen them just, the vehicle that catches on fire is going to have to be pulled out of the garage. Because again, they will not be able to, with the current firefighting technology, be able to put it out in the garage. So, where do we put it? If it's on the 3rd floor and I've got to drag this burning car, down ramps, probably not a good location to put my EV charger. On the other hand, yeah, that might be my only location. So I've got to think about, how am I going to address that? Something even as simple as, hey, are the association's parking spots deeded? And this is where you can get into more of the legal world. But what if the parking spaces that are closest to the building are a deeded parking space? But that's where it makes the most sense in order to put in the EV chargers, because we're right there next to the electrical room. Even if they're not deeded, do we put them outside? Do we put it inside? There's a lot of other considerations that you have to really take into account, other than just do we have the power? How many do we want to put in, and the technical stuff? Insurance. I've talked with insurance companies or insurance reps, and they kind of tell me at this point, they don't really see a big deal, a big bump in it. But on the other hand, I liken it to what's happened with, the structural inspections and the structural integrity reserve studies. A different presentation, but during that presentation, I mentioned that, what, I don't care what the state of Florida is going to do. Mortgage companies and insurance companies are going to ask for that information, so you're going to have to do it. And that was a result of the wake-up call, unfortunately, of Surfside. Unfortunately, it will probably, what will happen here is there will be a massive fire somewhere with loss of life or significant property damage, and the insurance companies will wake up and say, "Oh, wow, there's a risk here that we didn't realize we were taking." And so now we need to look at these things. And again, this is where we're talking about future proofing. there's so much that's going on. And while our primary focus on this is vehicles, cars, trucks, sedans, kind of a thing, we're talking a whole nother world now. Like, I talked about this on Monday, and I went and did some research on what you were showing with the bikes. And we have these electric bikes now, and the fire department's not real keen on you taking all these electric bikes and throwing them in a storage in the first floor of your parking garage with all those lithium batteries in there. So it's not just the vehicles that we got to start thinking about, but definitely, I could while I've driven both an electric vehicle and an electric bike, I can tell you I could see myself buying an electric bike before I bought an electric vehicle. And it's me personally, but I see that growing. So that's yet another area that really need to start taking into consideration.
And I think it just amplifies the idea of really good planning up front with your team is crucial, right? This is also infrastructure, folks. You do not want to pay for twice, sort of in 10 years. So to David's point, you don't want to go on the third floor of a 5-story parking structure, put in one station, and then realize you need 4 more. But now you have a critical infrastructure crossroads sort of decision to make. Do you feel confident for the next 10 years that should be there? Are you able to handle it? Do you have the right access? And again, this does require maintenance. It's not heavy maintenance. This is not exterior facade or windows or roof. But again, we do need to maintain it. We need to think about it. And when we want to daisy chain off it to grow it, because I think most people agree that we think that EV is going to grow versus not grow, that you want it all in the same place so your costs are as minimized as possible to continue to use it. So again, I think it can't be understated that this is really important to a really great checklist of questions that you ask in the beginning of the process, so you're not unhappy with the outcome.
And again, to really reiterate, if you take nothing else away from this presentation, understand that this is not a simple process. There are thousands of moving parts that have to be thought about, and what impacts happens over here is going to impact over here, and it's not necessarily straightforward. And as with everything in condominiums and HOAs, everyone is going to have an opinion. A lot of them are going to be very valid opinions. Some of them are going to be very loud opinions. And so, working through that process with facts and knowledge, like anything else, is going to be key to a successful implementation.
And I think just following up with that, because I want to be respectful of time for everyone, but I think one thing that we're also seeing in associations are where this is a shared amenity, that you really do need an SOP. You need rules. You need to understand what's going to happen, how to use it. Again, communal living is communal living. A shared amenity is a shared amenity. So I thought one thing that was really interesting in one association we work with that, and if people don't know this yet, that when you're plugged in and charging your car, that once you're finally charged, most of you, whether it's through the charging station or through your car, get a text. You get an email on your phone saying you're charged and you're done. Well, what happens if you sit there still plugged in for another hour or two, or you want to leave it overnight? Well, in this association, they made a rule where you paid $25 every 15 minutes for not moving it after a 15-minute grace period. And again, big association, small amount of charger stations, only a handful to start. And again, they had a penalty for the sticking around and not moving it. And by the way, it was managed by a third party, so your credit card was getting charged immediately. There was no refund. It was very, very hard to appeal this, but they wrote a very clear set of operational guidelines similar to the pool rules that we all have next to our pools, that there were sort of rules for how you're going to manage your EV charging use. So again, this is another thing to think about as you implement how you will manage that amenity, that shared amenity. And go ahead, David.
And you stirred something my brain was thinking about as well. Again, some of the decisions you talked about, pricing differentiation between guest and unit owners. I've even worked with some associations that they have a public area where they're not necessarily behind a gate, so you can even go to, do we open it up to the public and charge? You know, personal technical opinion, probably not a good idea, but that's a whole topic for another conversation. But even something as simple as, how do we, do you want to allow guests to use it? Or are you going to just limit it down to the unit owners? And that's somewhat more of a legal issue. But one of the other issues is, again, we talk about, there's a terminology out there called icing, where you have an internal combustion engine vehicle that parks in the spot and just parks there. You know, again, it's not just a technical aspect. Now, I would suggest that there's probably an excellent chance that your bylaws absolutely do not address this situation. So this is again another area that, again, beyond the realm of the technical scope here, but getting into more of the legal realm, that now you need to go back and revise your bylaws to put a bite in so that no one goes and parks their big Ford Expedition internal combustion engine in the EV charging space and just leaves it there. So again, want to really understand that there's a lot of moving parts.
It's really great now that you say that, because I was just in a community last week where a board member is driving an F-150 EV, and I saw my first F-150 EV, and we were walking a project they were on, and the front hood, opened up. It's all storage. There's no engine. It's a giant truck, and it's just yeah. It's not even like people just think EVs are these small, tiny little cars now. Now they're trucks and they're vans and they're big things. So this is great. Eric, any questions in the chat that we missed?
Yeah, we do actually have a couple. So
Great.
one of the questions was, and I think this goes back to sort of the feasibility study and where we kind of put these, but the question was, does the charging station need to be 30 feet from the building?
No, and I'm chuckling a bit because it's I have to laugh because it's only money. But the further away it is, so under probably more information than what they care for, but under the electrical code, from where my power source is to where my load source is, I can't have more than a 3% voltage drop. So the further out I get, the bigger the wire has to get. So the more expensive the wire has to get. Now, obviously, there's some limitations. I'm not going to go 2,000 feet away from my power source, but 30 feet is probably beyond 30 feet. Yeah, we do start getting into some pretty big wires. And if you haven't been to Lowe's or Home Depot recently to price wiring, it will take your breath away for for what it costs now. So the closer closer to the electrical room that you're able to be, the smaller that wiring is able to be, and the shorter the distance that wire is able to be, the better you are. But it can still be, it can be further than that, but it definitely comes at an increased cost.
And this is an interesting one. I'll ask it. I don't know if if we're going to be able to provide an answer for our purposes today. But for the statute, and the statute they quoted was 718.113,
Mhm.
and it regards hazard and liability insurance for individual chargers. And this individual spoke with the insurance commissioner, and she says she has no source for that type of insurance. Do we have any feedback? Again, I don't know if this is something we can really touch on in this instance. None of us are insurance brokers.
I could touch on it slightly, and again, with the caveat that I'm not an insurance broker, I'm not an insurance expert, but have actually had some of these conversations with insurance brokers, and their response is not a lot different than what the commissioner's response was. That's why this is still a new and growing, and that's why I say that we're going to have a catastrophic event somewhere, and the insurance company is going to realize that the risk that they're managing. But what the brokers have been telling me so far is that in general have just been covering them under the standard homeowners unit owners policies without really any increased additional expense. But a lot of that's going to be an insurance company by insurance company, underwriter by underwriter question.
And then do we have any feedback or suggestions on associations utilizing some of the newer technology like a charge box for say like the bicycles, and I believe there's even one, Alex, you mentioned was a EV bike rack, a powered EV bike rack. Do we have any feedback or suggestions for associations to look into some of those options?
We do. We have actually the city of New York and Manhattan came out with rules for their fight for lithium battery storage, and a lot of vendors have taken their lead from what New York has done. Secondly, there are two manufacturers I think that we've run up to now where EV bike charging can be done outside, and you can lock your bike to it's just a shorter power pole. Imagine like a EV charger that we showed. It's just shorter with the ability to lock your bike to it with a charging port on it, and they come with dual, and you can store them outside. There's also a company that manufactures essentially a cage, a box, and it looks like safe deposit boxes, I mean, sort of for lack of a better term, that can be stored outside. That box can be powered so individuals can plug in lithium batteries without bringing them inside to store inside. So the bike could still be stored inside without the battery, and the battery is being charged outside in a centralized, safer location. Definitely happy to talk to people about that. These are new technologies that we're seeing, and they're very interesting. And again, I think they will benefit many from insurance perspective and also rules and regulations for use, as technology improves with battery itself. We get them all, Eric?
There was one, and I'm not sure. I think we sort of answered this, but the question was: is there any specific code that speaks to how far the station needs to be from the building? I would assume this would just be based on your individual municipality or location of where your association is located.
The National Electric Code would be the big speaker to that. And again, the big driving force to that is how, the wire sizing as to how far away it is. That's really the big driving code.
Excellent. Well, that's all I have on my Q&A list here.
Great.
We did have an observation, though. I'll throw it in because we have just another minute. One of our attendees did quote a very actual useful statute here, but he's quoting it's unlawful for a person to stop, and this is an actual statute. It is unlawful for a person to stop, stand, or park a vehicle that is not capable of using an electrical recharging station within any parking space specifically designated for charging an electric vehicle. If a law enforcement officer finds a motor vehicle in violation of the subsection, the officer or specialist shall charge the operator or other person in charge of the vehicle in violation with a non-criminal traffic infraction. Now, I don't know necessarily if that would work inside your garage, right? To have an officer patrolling inside your condominium garage, or, trying to call a traffic enforcement person out. But it does show that boards would have the ability, right, to create rules, and I'm not necessarily saying maybe a bylaw, right, which would require an amended document, but having some sort of a penalty, fine, enforcement action created by the board to sort of eliminate that situation. And you'd have to work with your legal, right? And as your management company, we can help consult on that. But I think there are specific things that as this technology continues to be more and more and more adopted, associations and boards are going to have to deal with the ramifications of it. It's not something that's just a fad and it's going to go away. This is something that will be long term. And if you're looking at it now, great, you're ahead of the curve. It's definitely something that I would recommend for boards to maybe have in your 3 or 5 year plan to at least look at the feasibility of it. Things can change an awful lot from where they are now and to what they're going to be in 5 or 10 years. But at least knowing where your association stands so that when those requests do come in, you're able to enter truth to power and give your membership and give your association sort of the best outlay of what is involved. So instead of just shutting someone down and saying, well, I want an electric charger, and the board says, no, that's a fad, we're not going to address it, you'll at least have that feasibility study to speak the facts, right? And say, well, we're only permitted, our system can only handle this many. We can't have 40. A lot of our buildings have been built 40, 50 years. So that technology is sort of ahead of the curve on it. But I would say we'll look to have some more of these. I think EV charging is a great topic. I think it's on a lot of people's mind based on some of the questions, and there's just a lot of unknowns to it right now. So we'll be happy to have David come back. I will give everyone, let me make sure I have it up here so that I can give everyone their email addresses. So David, I'm going to post it here for you right now. If you have questions, please feel free to give David or I an email. You can David Riddle at driddle@thefalcongroup.us or my email, emalloy@akam.com. We'll be happy to answer any questions. David, I did have one question earlier. Would you be able to make the presentation, a soft presentation, available to any of our attendees that wish to go back over some of the slides?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. We can send it out. Yeah, just need the email addresses and be glad to do that.
Perfect. Well, David, I want to thank you for your time today. Again, this was a topic that's near and dear to my heart as a recent adoptee of an EV. Alex, as always, your feedback is invaluable for us on the management side. So I want to thank everybody for attending today.
Appreciate
Gentlemen,
it.
have anything in closing?
We're good. Have a great day, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you, David.
The same thing, Eric, both of you guys, I really appreciate it, and hopefully everybody got at least one golden nugget out of this. So thank you, everyone.